It could be that the Ukrainians are calculating that if they are able to seize control of the land bridge north of the Sea of Azov and potentially even crack the will of the Russian forces to continue their occupation of Crimea, this may have a follow-on effect, a strategic effect, more broadly across the country, forcing the Russians onto the defensive and ultimately towards defeat.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by the co-founder and director of research at the Council on Geostrategy. That's an NGO which focuses on geopolitics and environmental security. James Rogers, welcome to Frontline. Thank you so much for your time. And we're speaking just days after Vladimir Putin gave a date for the delivery of tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. He says it's able to start that delivery within weeks. How significant is this?
So I don't think it's particularly significant. I mean, I think this is a lot of signaling going on, and we've heard the Russian regime in the Kremlin make these noises at various points over the last few years, particularly since the invasion or the re-invasion of Ukraine back in February last year. I think this is more of a series of noises that the Kremlin makes when things are not going in accordance with its plans. The aim is to scare Western countries, particularly those such as the United States, the UK, Germany, Poland, and others, to prevent them or to stop them from providing support to the government in Kiev, which, of course, has significantly upset Russia's plans in relation to that country and forced Russia to take a very much more defensive position than it otherwise might have done. Now, making these noises every so often is supposed to intimidate the Western powers, and particularly to come between the people of those countries and their governments, and to try and prevent arms transfers from taking place to the government in Kiev, which of course will then find themselves used on the battlefield against Russian forces. And they have been used to great strategic and tactical effect over the last few months, particularly as Ukraine has initiated its counteroffensive in recent days against Russian forces to the south and east of Ukraine.
If you say it's not particularly significant, but it is designed to cause some concern against Western allies, presumably you think it's not going to work.
No, I mean, up until recently, there hasn't been any evidence that it's worked so far. There may be some political effect in countries such as Germany, where there has often been quite a strong, let's call it a peace lobby or an anti-nuclear lobby. And we've seen in recent weeks the president of Germany and the chancellor come under fire from in public rallies as people have questioned Germany's stance towards Russia and Ukraine. But this is something that Olaf Scholz, in particular, has handled quite effectively by firing back at the so-called protesters. Beyond that, I think the Russian moves have not had a great deal of impact. In the United States, they're largely discounted. In the United Kingdom also, we've seen the uptick of the kinds of weapons that have been deployed. Initially, they were supposedly primarily defensive, so anti-tank weapons such as the NLAW movements that the UK initiated early in the crisis, indeed even before the invasion got fully, or the renewed invasion got fully underway. And we've seen an increasing willingness on the part of Western governments to provide Ukraine with more advanced and more capable weaponry, including some of the most effective weapons in Western arsenals, such as modern battle tanks and long-range cruise missiles.
Belarus was against Russian military bases on its territory. It was against the annexation of Crimea and against nuclear weapons. Why the U-turn?
So, I mean, President Lukashenko has had quite a thorny relationship with Vladimir Putin in Russia. So this is an ongoing degree of discord. Of course, Belarus also seeks a degree of independence from Russia. It doesn't want to become entirely a pawn in Russia's geopolitical games. But at the same time, there's a great deal of pressure on Belarus from Russia. And Belarus has very few friends in the West, having isolated itself in recent years, particularly since the uprisings a couple of years ago in that country, and the way in which Western and particularly European governments responded. So Belarus seeks a degree of autonomy from Russia, but at the same time, there's a great deal of dependency. And insofar as Belarus has few friends in the West, it's unable to provide the degree of autonomy that it actually requires to chart an independent stance in relation to its foreign affairs.
And isn't that exactly what's happening with the movement of these weapons? That actually Belarus is being used as a pawn. Would you see it that way more than, or equally, as a kind of deterrent to Western allies, that this movement of the tactical weapons?
That at least on the part of Russia, I think that is the intention. Whether or not those weapons ever find themselves on Belarus territory is an entirely different question, and there is some possibility that this could only be another bluff on top of all of those that have come before, that Russia has initiated in order to try and discourage Western powers, and those in Europe particularly, from supplying arms to Kiev.
That is an interesting thought, isn't it? I mean, how likely is it that you think that these tactical nuclear weapons will never actually end up on Belarusian soil?
From a strategic standpoint, I don't really see any utility of placing them there. Russia's nuclear capabilities are extensive. Russia has the full range of nuclear capabilities. It can launch them from the sea, it can launch them from the land over very long distances. It can strike countries such as the UK and the United States directly from Russian territory or from Russian submarines located in the North Atlantic. Russia also has tactical nuclear weapons that it can deliver for battlefield effect. It has been argued that these will not be particularly effective in Ukraine, but I see no real strategic or even tactical reason for deploying them there in terms of being able to improve Russia's military effectiveness. It seems to me that this is more about signaling and to try and discourage Western governments from supporting the government of Kiev.
Russia has some 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons. We don't know how many will go to Belarus. You seem to be suggesting perhaps none at all. Could you just widen it and tell me exactly what these tactical weapons might be capable of doing?
So, tactical weapons, I mean, there's a huge discussion here about whether they actually exist. So you have a number of different nuclear capabilities. It is often said that there are strategic nuclear weapons. These are weapons that can be delivered over extremely long ranges, up to 12,000 kilometers. They're normally launched from nuclear submarines, ballistic missile submarines located in the murky depths of the North Atlantic, or from silos deep in Russia. The United Kingdom also has access to submarine-launched ballistic missiles, as do the United States, as well as those that are launched from silos. These kinds of weapons can have enormous and disproportionate effect if they're fired at strategic targets such as cities, large concentrations of troops, or even along entire battle lines. They can have yields up to 1 to 3 megatons. That means one on London or Moscow would take out most of the central area of the city and devastate the city for years to come. Then you have what are often called tactical nuclear weapons. These are much smaller, anything between 10 and 20 kilotons. But to put this into perspective, this is the same kind of yield that was used over Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the closing of the Second World War. So they're actually very large weapons, and they can have a significant effect, particularly if targeted or fired on hardened targets, as well as large troop concentrations. However, if you disperse your troops, and this is what the Ukrainians are said to be doing, over broader areas, then if they are fired against those troops, they should have a much smaller effect than they otherwise might if they were more concentrated. So I'm not entirely sure whether the Russians would ever seek to deploy them in actual fact against Ukrainian targets. Not only because they may not have a great deal of utility on the battlefield, particularly if the Ukrainians have already dispersed their troops, but also because of the international condemnation that would befall to Russia in the event that they were fired. Many of the countries in the developing world and also other large powers such as India and China might take a very firm line against Russia if it were to fire these kinds of weapons.
If we just return to the relationship between Belarus and Russia, you were talking earlier about how Belarus wants to assert its independence, but President Putin is exerting his influence. When President Lukashenko speaks of a union state of Russia-Belarus, how does that actually work in practical terms? Since 2020, we've already seen changes to Belarus's constitution, its security doctrine, interoperability. Is this effectively the process of dismantling the state?
I wouldn't go that far. As I said earlier, I think this is. I mean, there has been a strong union or an alliance between Belarus and Russia for many, many years. In fact, going all the way back since the beginning of Belarus' so-called independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is not, I think, an attempt by Russia to completely consume Belarus. That, after all, isn't really what Russia requires here. Russia already has a great deal of influence in what happens to Belarus. Not only is Belarus entirely isolated from much of the rest of the world, particularly the Euro-Atlantic community, the countries that are often described as being in the West, particularly those in NATO and the European Union. But he is also, or Belarus is also widely isolated from the rest of the world as well. So Russia already has a great deal of influence. I'm not sure it needs to go, so to say, the full way, or to take over the country in order to maintain that influence. And in fact, it may be more in Russia's interests to maintain this kind of halfway house where Russia has influence over Belarus, but it has not completely consumed the country into some kind of broader Russian union. I think this will be particularly the case while Russia is so heavily bogged down in trying to take control of large tracts of Ukrainian territory. And indeed, as we know from earlier on in this crisis in February, trying to seize the entire Ukrainian state by the decapitation of the government of Vladimir Zelensky.
And as the counteroffensive gets underway in Ukraine, if we enter a long attritional war that could go into next year and perhaps beyond that, what are the chances of an increasingly desperate President Putin launching another attack on the capital from Belarus to force some kind of breakthrough?
Yes, so I mean, this is already a very long attritional war. We shouldn't forget that it began in 2014 when Ukraine seized Crimea and fomented a conflict in the Donbass region of Ukraine. So it has already been going on for over 9 years. So it is very likely that this war will continue for some months or even indeed years to come. There's sometimes a hope, I think, in some Western capitals, including even, I would say, in those of the UK and the US, that this war will end relatively quickly, but it's also quite likely that it would go on for quite some time. We've now seen the Ukrainian counteroffensive get underway towards the east and the southeast of the country. We also saw, of course, the destruction of the Kharkovka Dam last week, which caused a great deal of misery in the south of Ukraine. But whether or not this leads to an increasingly isolated and frustrated Mr. Putin to lash out against Ukrainian targets using means that so far he has not been willing to use is a really interesting question. I would argue that at this stage this is very, very unlikely for the very reason I identified earlier, because there are very few countries that support Russia, and it would really pull them away from providing support, both active and tacit. Even those countries that have been the most supportive of Russia, I think, would find it quite difficult to support the use of nuclear weapons. In any case, there are actually additional measures that Russia could initiate before moving up to the threshold of nuclear use. These would include the use of what are sometimes described as massive ordnance air blast weapons. Russia is reportedly has those in its arsenal. That's the use of a very large conventional bomb, not unlike those that have been used by the United States in Afghanistan, or indeed by the UK against Germany during the Second World War. Those potentially could be used before we move up to the nuclear threshold, assuming that that is a possibility. Whether or not Mr. Putin would seek to use additional Russian assets against Ukraine, such as enhanced airstrikes, bringing to bear the full weight of Russia's aviation forces, is another interesting question. So far, this hasn't occurred, which would either lead us to conclude that these assets are not to the standard that we initially thought they might be, or simply that he hasn't yet chosen to draw them into the fight for the reasons that they haven't necessarily been needed, given the tactical objectives of Russian forces to the south and east of the country.
And in that light, how do you see each side pursuing their strategies in the coming weeks?
So I think we're going to see an increasing Ukrainian push. Now, we saw the initiation of what we've sometimes describe as shaping operations over the last couple of weeks. The use of long-range fires against Russian logistics infrastructure and also Russian forces a longer range. And the Ukrainians have brought to bear, for example, the Storm Shadow cruise missiles that the United Kingdom has provided and the HIMARS systems that the United States has provided to great tactical and strategic effect. Now, last week, this seemed to move into a different tempo. And then on Friday, President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that the counteroffensive had actually begun. Now, this has been kept in great silence or great secrecy over recent weeks because, of course, the Ukrainians do not want to give away their battle plans to their Russian enemy. So it seems that the counteroffensive is now in full swing. So what you might ask is Ukraine's battle plan. At this point, it's still quite hard to say, I think, but we do know that geography is a potent master. We know that Russia has seized territory to the southeast of the country, north of Crimea, and also to the east of the country in Donetsk, or the area that's often described as the Donbass. So Ukraine has initiated or has claimed that its objective is to remove the occupying armies of Russia from all of Ukrainian lands, which also includes Crimea. And I think since the atrocities that Russia has committed across the country and also particularly north of Kiev during February and March last year, the Ukrainian people are increasingly of the view that Russia needs to be removed entirely from Ukrainian territory. Now, whether or not Ukraine has the means to actually do this is still an open question. But it is the case that increasing numbers of Western forces have been provided to Ukraine in recent months and days, weeks, and these are now being massed and being put into effect. So we have larger numbers of Western tanks, including the Challenger from the UK and the Leopard from Germany and a number of other countries. These are now being brought to bear, along with, as I said earlier, the Storm Shadow cruise missile system and the HIMARS rocket artillery system. It seems to me that Ukraine has two objectives or two fronts. Firstly, towards the east near Bakhmut, and then to the south to re-establish control over the land bridge that Russia has established between Crimea and other parts of occupied Ukrainian territories and ultimately Russia itself. It seems to me that what we are now witnessing is particularly a Ukrainian push into Donetsk, but also more importantly towards the south. I think what Ukraine will try to do is to disestablish the land bridge that's been established north of the Sea of Azov so that it can cut off Crimea from Russia itself. Now, this, of course, depends on a number of other variables, such as taking out or potentially incapacitating the Kerch Strait Bridge, which we know that Ukraine tried to do previously, and it would also require a significant number of troops to hold the land bridge once it's been retaken from Russia.
Ukraine, it is said, is under pressure to show some small victories to prove to its Western backers that it is capable of making breakthroughs. Where would they be?
So far, the reports have come in only this morning that Ukrainian forces have taken a number of small towns and villages in Donetsk, including Blahodatna and Nechkuchna. These are two initial small settlements of a few hundred or a few thousand people. Of course, they're not sufficient to provide a decisive victory, and there's a very long way to go. I said that if it is the case that Ukraine's counteroffensive is directed towards the disestablishment of the land bridge north of the Sea of Azov, Ukraine will need to take some far larger settlements along that land bridge, and those contain much larger populations, such as Tokmak with a population of 32,000 and Melitopol with a population of 150,000. These are not large urban areas, but they're still fairly large towns or even small cities. And urban warfare, as we know, is often very difficult. And Ukraine will need to seize them in order to move forward and take control of this particular piece of territory to disestablish this land bridge that is currently occupied by the Russians. So the Ukrainians still have a huge task ahead of them, and this is only to take this land bridge or to disestablish it. Taking on the rest of the Donbass to the east of the country is an entirely different kettle of fish. But it could be that the Ukrainians are calculating that if they are able to seize control of the land bridge north of the Sea of Azov and potentially even crack the will of the Russian forces to continue their occupation of Crimea, this may have a follow-on effect, a strategic effect, more broadly across the country, forcing the Russians onto the defensive and ultimately towards defeat.
And if we could just return to the subject of nuclear weapons, you have expressed doubt that tactical nuclear weapons will ever be used by Russia in Ukraine. In the wider picture, Russia has suspended its participation in New START, the last remaining arms control between Russia and America in February. If we are accepting that we are indeed in a new Cold War, at what stage do you think the global nuclear arms race is?
So I would like to say that I've expressed doubt that Russia will use nuclear weapons, but I'm not going to say that it should be ruled out entirely. I think we have to be very careful here so that we do not disincentivize ourselves to provide the Ukrainians with the forces that they require in order to secure victory. And ultimately, it is for them to decide whether they wish to push this to its logical conclusion in terms of securing that victory. After all, it is their country. Now, in terms of Russia's support for nuclear arms control more generally, yes, it is absolutely the case that Russia has been moving away from the arms control treaties that were established during and immediately after the First Cold War with the Soviet Union. And this is indicative of the deterioration, worsening of the strategic environment, both globally and in particular in Europe, which is where the sort of rules-based international system was thought to be at its densest or its most effective. And this, of course, opens up a whole array of issues for European countries to deal with, as it did during the First Cold War. It is also indicative of a deterioration of the international environment more generally, but this is something that has been clearly picked up in most of the major powers' recent defense and security reviews, including our own refresh of the integrated review that was published earlier in March this year. It's also been picked up in the Australian strategic defense paper, as well as in Japanese and American strategic planning. So the deterioration of the broader international environment does not play well, of course, and this also connects with Russia's actions in Eastern Europe. However, having said all of that, I think we need to be very reluctant to act in a way that Russia seeks us to act, for the simple reason that that would then potentially destabilize Ukraine and prevent it from securing victory.
How much more dangerous do you think the world is with this deteriorating situation that you describe?
So it is actually, I think, quite precarious. And it's not just in relation to Russia. We've also seen other countries in recent years, such as Iran trying to pursue nuclear weapons, and also North Korea generating a nuclear capability, although one that is still rather limited. In addition to that, we've seen the People's Republic of China attempting to modernize its own nuclear forces, as well as to extend them in breadth and scope. So in that context, I would argue that potentially we're moving into an international era or a phase of time that is potentially as volatile as the early Cold War, or the First Cold War in Europe in the 1940s and 1950s, particularly the 1950s. And beyond that, we don't seem to have the alliance infrastructure in place that we established during the late 1940s and early 1950s, i.e. that of NATO, to secure the democracies. And that is something I think that leaders in the UK, in the US, in Japan, in France, Germany, Poland, Australia, and other major countries need to think about going forward. Deterring threats to our survival, to our interests is critical at this time.
James Rogers, great to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producer, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye-bye for now.